Let me ask you one thing before we talk about your adult life, which is something you and I were discussing the other day, which is something that people find fascinating about your story, which is your father's decision so early to leave. Do you want to say something about that?
My father came to Germany as a very young child when he was 8 years old, and he was born actually in a part of Poland known as Galicia, which is now the Ukraine. And he was brought up there by a family because he had just lost his father, and the family took care of him. And he then started working, did very well indeed, and got married with family then arriving. The circumstances under which we left in 1933 are that my father had always a sense of insecurity, having come to Germany from the east, where they were used to excesses by the Cossacks, and sort of every so often you had a major massacre of Jews. I mean, you take Kishinev, for example, which came, of course, much earlier, but there was always a feeling of great insecurity, and a lot of what were called Ostjuden left Poland and the other countries, the Baltic countries, and came to Germany primarily. And as a result of having left so early his place of birth and living in Germany, he was much more sensitive of the unrest which took place in the Weimar Republic. So I'm talking about 1918 to 1933. That was a very unruly, even though, I mean, scientifically and culturally speaking, it was a tremendous period. I mean, the Weimar years were extraordinary, but you had this feeling in Germany that they had lost the First World War because of the stab in the back, and of course the Jews were again sort of thought of as being responsible for the disaster that had overtaken Germany. There was unrest, and Hitler's gang, of course, they made progress under these circumstances, and finally, when the election results were announced, Hitler became Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, if I remember correctly. And my father felt that this is very bad news indeed. And he and many other Ostjuden people in similar situation to him, they all felt, no, we're not going to go through all this here now in Germany, what we've had to endure in the eastern countries. So my father was very sensitive to any sort of manifestations of anti-Semitism and so forth. And when Hitler finally made it, and he started introducing very quickly the anti-Semitic laws, etc., that took place within a matter of months. Academics were dismissed from their positions at university. So my father said, no, I'm not going to hope that he's going to be ousted, because the feeling amongst German Jews who had been in Germany for many generations, they could not understand that a group like the Nazis were able to remain in power for any length of time. The feeling always was, for example, Schacht, who was the finance minister, who was a very right-wing, but he thought, well, Hitler is going to get rid of all the unrest, but we will control him. We will make sure, we'll get rid of him when the time is due. And my father didn't believe that. He thought this is not all that likely, so we made arrangements to leave. Whereas the German Jew, as they were called, the Jackers, that was the nickname of those who had lived there for many generations, they could not, many of them had served in the German army in the First World War with great distinction, etc., and they couldn't believe that the country of Heine and Schiller and Goethe and Bach and so forth, that would degenerate.
Well, you tell a small story in the book that really struck home with me because as a child, when I was learning the piano, like a lot of people learning the piano, one played music. There was Peter's edition.
Yes,
And of
English,
course, like you think not at all about who these people are, but you tell the most extraordinary story, which is that the two sons left. One came to London, one to New York. But of course, the father
died in
could not
Auschwitz.
believe that actually Germany would become what it became.
That's an excellent example you're giving. That's right. That was Hinrichsen was the name of the Peters Verlag in Leipzig. That's right. And the old man, I think he was 70 odd, and he was taken to Auschwitz, where he died. That's right. Whereas it's
well, thinking about your father, one little detail which I rather loved that you tell in the story of your childhood is that by great good fortune in a way, you travelled to England on your father's expired Polish passport, which of course, when you think about it, was enormously advantageous because the British didn't think you were German.
That's right, that's right. We travelled on an expired Polish passport, even though, and my mother was already a first generation born in Germany. My mother was born in Berlin, and yet she carried a Polish passport too, because it's not like in England. If you're born in England, you have a British passport. If you were born in Germany and you were not naturalized, then you carried the passport of your father. And so both my parents had expired Polish passports, that's right. And when we arrived and we were able to show Polish passports, even though they were no longer valid, we were acclaimed as friendly aliens, allies, because the whole war started as a result of Poland being invaded by the Germans.
Now, so I've got you in my summary to England, and time for some questions, but I can't resist a little in-joke, which your family will think, oh no, not that. But I'm going to get this wrong, but there is, I know from knowing you for a number of years, the ultimate Ralph Kohn phrase, which is Nagel mit Kopfer.
Nägel mit Köpfer. Nägel mit Köpfer.
Now, we should explain, but I mean, it's in English, I suppose the nearest equivalent is getting down to brass tacks.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I can see your wife thinking, oh
that
no.
Nägel mit Köpfer.
Oh no, he knows these phrases.
I've driven people mad with this phrase, you know. I mean, for example, we've got this Bach cantata concerts on a Sunday, and Jonathan Freeman Atwood, who's the principal with whom I'm extremely friendly, and when we started thinking about it, and I was always very impatient. I used to say, Jonathan, you've got to get on with this. We've got to get this program going, and so forth. And then I wrote Nägel mit Köpfer. In other words, you know, we've got to hammer it in. That's really the thing. I mean, let's get down to brass tacks. But the real thing is nails, which have a head on it, and you hammer it in. Yes. Can we get on with it?
Now,
I've done that to many people, and they said, "Oh no, not Nägel mit Köpfer again."
No, as you said, I'm trying to have a glance with my chairman because I'm hoping she will use this phrase in our board meeting tomorrow. If people rather
I hope she will
veer off the point. See, I can rely on Mary. She's a chemist. She's going to make sure this happens.
Good.
Now, so I want to start with you at Salford Grammar, and. An impediment, which is you were very keen to study biology. And I have two questions. Why were you so keen? Yeah. And tell us about why that proved to be actually rather problematic at your school.
Yeah. Well, there was actually, I wanted to do biology because at the back of my mind was the idea that I might become a doctor, a physician, do medicine. And for that, of course, you've got to have biology as your school subject. And there was actually medicine in the family. There was a certain Professor Selma Aschheim, who was a very distinguished gynecologist working at the Charité Hospital in Berlin. And in fact, the first test for pregnancy was the Aschheim-Zondek test. And that was the Aschheim who had describe it for the first time, I think, in 1927. So we had one doctor in the family who made a very great career. And the second was someone whom my good friend Roger Williams, whom I'm delighted to see here today, who was became a very distinguished liver pathologist. And in the book, he's referred to as Geggy. You remember
yes,
the
indeed,
name?
your cousin.
And
Yes,
that's my
yes.
cousin, first cousin. And he actually stayed with us in Amsterdam, whereas his family, his parents, went to what was then known as Palestine in the 30s. And Geggy stayed with us in order to do medicine at Amsterdam University. And he qualified as a doctor. And he had a huge effect on me because he lived with us for since 1935 until 1940. And that's when he completed his medical studies. And so I had 2 points of reference, Aschheim and my cousin. So I thought I'd follow in that tradition. It didn't work out because when I completed my higher school certificate, that was about 1946. I applied to various universities to study medicine, but I wasn't accepted for the very good reason that priority was given to returning ex-servicemen. My own brother, for example, as soon as we got to England, within about 6 months, he was in the British Army. I mean, he wouldn't join the Polish Army for various reasons, but he was 5 years in the British Army. And it was, the government made the decision, which I think was very correct, that returning ex-servicemen should be given priority, and 90% of places were allocated, of university places were allocated to returning ex-servicemen. Now, I got a scholarship to the university, but it wasn't good enough. You had to have a state scholarship in order to qualify under that 10% of students who got places. So I wasn't able to get into medical school, and I waited 1 year and spent most of my time at Ryland's Library, if you know it.
Wonderful
and
place,
I did a
of
lot
course.
of reading,
Yes.
and both medical topics, etc., and also on music, because I was always very much involved in music. But when I saw that the next year there still was this tremendous pressure on places for medicine, I decided, no, well, let's
Get on with life.
let's do a bit of
Yes.
lateral thinking.
Yes.
So that's when
So I'm going to come on to your pharmacology in a second, but before
Yeah.
we take you to university, there's one person I want to ask you about, because you write with great skill and amusement and affection about your school teachers.
Yeah.
And the person I have to ask you about, because I feel terribly sorry for him, is your chemistry teacher, Mr. Duckworth.
Yeah.
You had quite a hard time. You explain
Yes,
his
well,
problem.
Well, of course, the younger teachers were all in the army, and we had to be satisfied with those who should have retired long ago, and the schools were absolutely full with people, well in their 60s and so on. And one of them was Sam Duckworth, our chemistry teacher, and he always loved to demonstrate sort of test tube reactions. And I remember on one occasion, he always predicted the outcome beforehand. So he'd have 2 test tubes, and he said, now if I pour this into this test tube, you will see the color will turn red. And lo and behold, it turned blue. So of course, there was tremendous laughter and jeering, etc. And Duckworth then turned to us and said, well, what can you expect? Wartime chemicals. and this expression was, I mean, any of you who have lived through the wartime period, I mean, this was used, anything that went wrong, it's the war.
2 questions about music, because this is when you're a young man and the whole world is before you, and 2 questions. One is about Gigli
Gigli.
performing. And
Yeah.
it seems certainly from the book to have been a seismic moment for you musically.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, perhaps I could just backtrack. In Amsterdam, I started my musical interest, and I learned the violin, and that with a member. And my teacher was a man from the Concertgebouw Orchestra, which of course is a world famous orchestra, and so that's where it started. But then, of course, with leaving Amsterdam in 1940, coming to England, refugees, and there was really no way that I could start again. But I didn't really. I must be frank. I didn't think the violin was my instrument, so I didn't do too much about. But I listened to music continuously. I went to the concerts of the Halley Orchestra, of course, which was the Manchester Orchestra, and so forth. And I remember on one occasion, Gigli, who was perhaps the greatest tenor of his time, came to Manchester, and he gave a recital in the Bellevue, because the Free Trade Hall had been destroyed by bombing during the war. And he gave only with piano accompaniment, and he sang these marvelous, magnificent aria antica, as the Italians call them, old arias from troubadours, and afterwards, let's say the early Italian, the Baroque sort of composers, arias from Baroque opera and so forth. And he kept us spellbound for 2 hours, singing one magnificent song after the other. And I thought, well, this is the ultimate. I've never heard anything like it, and I became very, very interested in vocal music. Yeah.
So the other musical question I want to ask you, you tell very quietly, actually, a rather astonishing story about going to hear the Concertgebouw give a concert. And this is where your childhood suddenly comes back in the most unexpected way. Could you just tell us that story?
Well, in order to celebrate they had a new hall built after the war, and they invited the Concertgebouw to give that concert, and they were at the time under Eduard van Wijnum. He was their conductor. I mean, the famous conductor, of course, was Willem Mengelberg. He was the great conductor. But it was van Wijnum who came over to England, and he conducted the Concertgebouw in this celebration concert. And I went to the general rehearsal, and there I saw my old teacher, a man called Sam Tromp. He was Jewish, and and I thought, my goodness, and I hadn't seen him, of course, for about 10 years or more. And after they'd finished with their dress rehearsal, I went up to him and I said, Mr. Tromp, do you still remember me? And of course, he had aged considerably. And he said, well, you tell me. So then, of course, he remembered. And he actually was in Theresienstadt during the war. And in fact, Sahava went to school with Tromp's son afterwards, didn't you? Yeah, so that, and we saw each other after the war in this way.
So we now need to leap from Manchester to Rome, because you want
La
to
Dolce
travel.
Vita.
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, I could interrogate you about how much you seem to have enjoyed your time in Rome, and we'll come on to that in a moment.
This is heavily censored.
Oh, heavily censored, exactly. Yes. You can guess, those of you who know both of us, that we did have a preliminary lunch to make sure neither of us would have been in any way embarrassed. But this is an extraordinary period because, so you went in 1954 to the Instituto Superiore di Sanità, and originally to work with Daniel Bouvet, who of course won the Nobel Prize in 1957 for his work on neurotransmitters.
Yeah.
So you already had this extraordinary thing, and just when you think it couldn't get better, you then have an encounter with a legendary scientist in a lift.
Yes.
Tell us about
Well, that's
that.
right. Well, I got a fellowship to take me to Rome to work with this man, Daniel Bouvet, who was perhaps the leading pharmacologist in the world. In fact, he got, as Ian already mentioned, he got the Nobel Prize in 1957 for 3 major discoveries, but we won't go into that. And so I went over to Rome to work with him, but I also knew that another very distinguished scientist was working at this institute, and that was Sir Ernst Chain. Chain left Oxford. I don't know the exact circumstances. He was a difficult man. He had a lot of trouble with people, and I think he wanted to change his position. Anyhow, he was offered the job as head of the microbiology section in Rome, and with huge funding from the Rockefeller Institute and so forth. And so Chain, I knew, was also at the same institute where I was going to be. And I was hoping one day I'll meet him, of course. And that happened when I was in the lift going up to the 6th floor to where my lab was. And Chain also came into the lift. I was talking to his senior assistant, and English, of course, and he then turned to me and says, "Are you from England?" And I said, "Yes." So he said, "Well, what are you doing here?" So I told him I was working with Bouvet and so forth. And what are you? I said, "Well, I'm a pharmacologist." And he instantly said, "Well, I have a project where I need a pharmacologist." And he says, "Come into my office." So from the lift, I went straight to his office. And he then described, he was interested in the intermediate metabolism of carbohydrates. And so he said, "I need somebody to do some liver perfusions." Roger, I was in hepatology before you. So he said to me, "So I need somebody to do some liver perfusions, and will you, et cetera, et cetera." And he described the project. So I said, "Well, I'd love to, but, I'm committed to Beauvais. I must get sort of clearance for this." So he said, "Oh, well, you should be able to do that. I need this. Well, just tell Beauvais, And he had a very strong personality. And anyhow, I went to Beauvais, and Beauvais was just the opposite. His temper, he was a very, very reserved man. Beauvais was not an administrator, but his wife, who was working with him, it was the administrator of his department, and anyone who wanted anything, apart from scientific advice, for which, of course, you went to Beauvais, you saw his wife, who also was there, and she was a very prominent, very powerful lady. So I went to, Beauvais said, "Well, if you'd like to do a bit of work with Chain, I have no objections, but you better check with my wife first." So I went to see Philomena, as her name was, and she said to me, "Well, we have tried several times to work together with Chain and his group, but it's never worked out. But if you want to try it, then by all means do so." So I had very, very happy...
But this story also illustrates something you talk about earlier on in your book. In German, you would call it the 3 Gs. You need money,
you need
ability,
4 things.
patience, and Glück.
And Glück, that's the one. That's ehrlich. Geld, Geduld, Glück, and Geschick. So these are the 4 Gs which you need for successful experimentation. And
I think after you left, Bouvet and his wife said that you had uniquely united 2 departments that had been at war for years.
Well, yes, we had a party in the library, and then Madame Bouvet, as we used to call her, then said, "Well, you have done very nice work. I won't call you the greatest scientist we've ever come across, but one thing we shall always remember you by, you are the first one who has succeeded in bringing the 2 departments together and realizing joint publications." And she said, that's how we will remember you."
Now, we need to discuss the other side of your life in Rome, because I was teasing you the other day about the fact that you embraced the joy of being in Rome, and one of the things was that you were leaving the lab sometimes early in the afternoon to go and have singing lessons, and I was suggesting this was, not exactly scientifically rigorous, and you pointed out to me the whole point of a travel scholarship is to embrace life. But talk about your singing teacher, and we're going to also hear you a little recording of you singing an aria in a moment. But tell me about your singing teacher, because this was clearly a subject of great joy to you.
I was mixing with some of the bohemians in Rome, and many of them were sort of studying singing in Rome. And I was told, well, your voice might be, you might have a suitable voice to sing. Anyhow, I was introduced to a man by the name of Manlio Marcantoni, who was regarded as one of the top voice production teachers. And Marcantoni was a great friend of Gigli. They were born in the same place in Italy, in Recanati, a small place near Ancona, and they were still very much in touch. And I had singing lessons twice a week with Marcantoni, and when I knew that he was a personal friend of Gigli, I said, look, can't you arrange for me to meet Gigli? It's my greatest sort of desire in life to do so. And Marcantoni would say, yes, but Dottore, you're not ready yet to confront, how can I introduce you to Gigli, you're not ready to sing. And so I said, well, never mind about the singing. I just want to meet him, but maybe I might even sing an aria for him, see what he thinks. And I said, but how can I introduce you? So I said, well, I'll tell you what. Gigli at the time was in heart failure, and he was a diabetic. So I said to Marcantoni, why don't you, because they saw each other quite frequently, why don't you tell Gigli that here is a young man, a doctor, who is working, in fact, I was working with diabetic animals as well, that he knows a lot about all the treatments for these things, and he's also very, very enthusiastic in his singing. Would you be prepared to meet him? Anyhow, so it was arranged for us to go to Gigli's mansion, and we spent the most fantastic 2 hours together. And then at one point Gigli said to me, what will you sing for me? And I had with me the aria Bella siccome un angelo, Malatesta's aria by Donizetti. So I had that with me, and I sang that to Gigli. And at the end of it, he says, molto bene, sort of very nice. And he said, and then he actually sang it in the baritone key, because, for which it was written, of course. And then he gave me various tips and so forth. And then he wrote to me a little letter afterwards to say that I've heard Ralph Kohn and so forth, and I can attest to his having very musical, but he's not yet ready, etc. But if he perseveres, he should be able to make a professional career. And that was that.
After Rome, you then got a scholarship to the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. And if we had more time, I would ask you about Alfred Gilman that you worked with, who was a legendary pharmacologist. But the interesting part of the story is that he was a very shrewd judge of character, and very early on said to you, Kohn, you're not a lab man. And really was the man who gave you the entry into SmithKline and French, where you spent a large part of your career. And your job, as I understand it, was fascinating. So here was a major drugs company that was looking for interesting science going on in Europe, that it might turn into large-scale drugs, particularly over the counter. And so you had an extraordinary job where you were sort of like a roving ambassador for this major pharmaceutical company, and you had this extraordinary set of skills. You spoke many languages, and of course, it's not just about the languages. You understood European culture very well. And I want you to tell one particular story that I roared with laughter when I read it, which is your meeting with the Soviet Ministry of Health when you were trying to persuade them also to be part of working with SmithKline?
Yeah, that was about 1960. We decided to, in fact, SmithKline and French were, when I joined them, still a relatively modest-sized company, but under license, they managed to get hold of a certain drug from France, which made them a great fortune. It's largactil chlorpromazine for the treatment of psychotic diseases, and that was their entry into the big league. That's how. And as it came from abroad, it came from France, from Rompoulenc. The president of SmithKline said, "Look, we can only do a small fraction of research here internally, but there's a big world, and we should have people who are watching who does what." Now, this is not industrial espionage. You know, people always say to me, "What did you try and find out?" No, far from it, just the opposite. But there are many medium, smaller-sized companies who are not, for example, represented in the United States. The United States is a very expensive market to enter into. I mean, if you're going to start marketing and so forth. So unless you're a big company, you really, in those days, you couldn't hope to enter the United States. So licensing agreements. And the idea then came, why don't we have a specialized small unit in the company that roams the world and goes to research institutes, companies, universities, whatever it is, and sees what research could we fund, participate in, and then get rights for the United States. Now, I should add here, whenever I, or my colleagues, whenever we went to see people, the first thing was, we don't want to know any of your secrets. Anything which is not patented, we are not interested in. So anything that you can talk about and you have safeguarded yourself, come and talk to us. And we established a great reputation because of this enormous success with the drug we got from France. So that was really our way of presenting ourselves. Look what we have done with this drug in America for the French, you know, and we can do the same for you if you've got the appropriateness. And anyhow, that I just had to give you this background. And then we decided we should go to Moscow as well and talk to the Soviet in those days, Soviet Ministry of Health, to see whether there are some possibilities of collaboration. And we met the deputy health minister, a lady by the name of Yakovleva, and she received us. There was our chairman and another director and me. We went to talk to I don't speak Russian, so we did have to have an interpreter. But I did the sort of talking on the scientific collaboration side, and I said, well, you know, why we are here. And so Madame Yakovleva then said, actually, she said, you know, when we do research in the medical field, we are great believers in publishing it in the journals, and it is open to the world. We don't believe in patents. We don't believe in. We don't think that this is the way. We shouldn't do that and deprive people from getting medication by putting it, you know, making a business out of it. Drugs should be free of patents, etc. We don't believe in it. Anyhow, after she'd given me this very interesting lecture about how they work, I said to her, well, look, I've had a lot to do with the Czech and Hungarian industries, and the Hungarians were amongst the first in the pharmaceutical business in the 19th century already. And I said, you know, we do have actually agreements with the Hungarians and the Czechs. Now, is there a difference in ideology here between you and your comrades in the other countries? How does this work? And then she gave me the most wonderful reply. She said, "Oh, no, there's no difference whatsoever. We in the East in the socialist bloc, we all have the same ideas, the same philosophy. What I have said to you before is the way we would like to see it. But at the moment, we haven't quite reached this idealistic state. So consequently, we would also be happy, and we would follow the capitalist line. But we don't want to. But because this is the way it is for the moment. So as long as you know, and the thing which struck me was, it was almost an obsession. There is no difference in any of us here in the East, whoever they are, the Romanians, the Poles, all of us think exactly along socialist lines and so forth. And that was the remarkable story. But we had such a good laugh about that later. But anyhow, that was her answer.
So I'm conscious of time, and I really want to ask about two final areas before we finish. We will finish, of course, with Bach. But before we get to Bach, we need to understand how you ended up setting up your own business. And in the book, you talk about a very important moment in your life, and it was either in 1959 or 1960, when you met in a hotel Konman Lauer, who was a great friend of your father's. Yeah. And I want you to tell everyone what he said to you, but also what an extraordinary man, and a story that I didn't know about a part of history that I thought I did know. So, two questions.
In the 30s, whilst we were living in Amsterdam, my father was very closely associated with a man called Koloman Lauer. He was a businessman Hungarian by birth, but he was a very, very substantial man and did very active in various countries. He was Jewish, and he had to get out of Budapest, where he had lived, and he made his way to Stockholm. In Stockholm, he set up a company, an import-export company, and he appointed to his board a man called Wallenberg, right? Raoul Wallenberg. And he was he was 32 years old, Swedish, from this aristocratic Wallenberg family, and he was working with Lauer, etc. In 1944, Hungarian Jews had escaped deportation to Auschwitz and these very others. So, whereas in all the other countries, Jews had been deported to Bergen-Belsen, to Auschwitz, etc. But in Hungary, the deportations had not really started because Horthy, who was the president, he wasn't he was anti-Semitic, but he didn't want to get involved too much with this whole thing. So, but in 1944, the Germans suddenly insisted that Jews should be deported from Hungary. There were 700,000 in Hungary. Now, Lauer was, of course, of Hungarian origin. He had family, he had friends, etc. But altogether, he was very keen to play a role. They were looking for a man, and Sweden had a particular. They had an ambassador and a legation in the city, and they were actively helping as far as they could, but you needed somebody to go there, to go to Hungary in order to organize things. And first of all, Count Bernadotte was suggested for the job, but he was vetoed by the Hungarian fascist government. So then the Americans, Roosevelt stepped into the picture, and the Americans then said, we will finance this operation, but we need somebody a Swede, because they have a good relationship with the Hungarians. So Koloman Lauer then went to the Swedish authorities and said, this man who's working with me, this man, Raoul Wallenberg, is an excellent man. He is a Swede. He's got all the credentials. He is a very smart man. He is a linguist. Why don't we take him and let Wallenberg go to Budapest and look after, see what we can do. So it was really Lauer, and that's now been established beyond any doubt. It's now in all the books. Lauer was the man who got Wallenberg to Hungary, and he actually saved 100,000 Jews.
And you also say in the book that, I mean, your father and Lauer were great friends, and you say there's a wonderful thing you discovered later in life from your father, which is that he had been receiving some imports from Lauer that were boxes of Tokai, the sweet wine. Of course, you then discovered later in life that this was also a way of helping the Hungarian Jews smuggle currency out of Hungary.
Absolutely, yes. Within these boxes of Tokai wine, there were compartments where you could slide in money. And those were sent from Hungary to Amsterdam, where Lauer would take, and that they came to us, to our house, and Lauer, it was passed over to him, and that he could make arrangements for this money to be then kept for those people.
So this extraordinary man you met, and you were feeling pretty smug about life, weren't you, in 1959? You had a wonderful job, you were travelling the world, you were a cosmopolitan man, and suddenly this man stops you in your tracks.
Yes, he did. I went to Switzerland, to Basel. I was managing director at the time of a Swiss company. And the subsidiary, the British subsidiary. And so I came to Basel, met him in the Euler Hotel, which is the very fine hotel, and I met Lauer again. This was about 1959, and I hadn't seen him since 1939. So we're talking about 20 years afterwards. And we had the most extraordinary meeting. And he said to me, well, what are you doing? And so forth. And I told him I had a wonderful job and were very interesting and so forth. And he then said to me, well, have you thought, how can you become independent? And I thought, my goodness, I'm working for for a company, a major company and so forth. How can this, why should I be worried about independence? But he kept on saying, look, in this uncertain world, the more independence you can have, the better. And I would suggest that you look into the possibility, even in the pharmaceutical industry, there must be areas where you can play an independent role rather than be. And he kept on, and that thought actually stayed with me.
I wonder if you feel that biology has surprised us with the layers of mystery that it still has, and whether you felt we will be further on in understanding living systems by now.
Well, we have made enormous advances, haven't we? I mean, I can think, for example, when I started my pharmacology in the 40s, we just started a fantastic period. Penicillin, lots of other antibiotics were discovered, streptomycin and all the other mycins, etc. We had cortisone, we had then gradually treatment for hypertension and rheumatic diseases, vaccine, polio vaccine, and so forth. I mean, there was an enormous amount was actually done in the development of new drugs. And I mean, if I think, for example, of immunotherapy, which is now sort of coming into its own in the treatment of cancer, I mean, these are all very major advances. And I would have thought, I didn't know that this was, that this type of development would take place. And I think we're still in for a lot of new discoveries.
What do you think of the mega trials that now have to be done to satisfy regulatory authorities? I mean, you and I did quite a few trials, quite small, very successful, good results, but now multi-million.
I mean, in the times when we used to work together, Roger, I mean, trials were of much smaller numbers, were satisfactory. But I think today we're living in a different era where, safety seems to be, something which we have to do at whatever it costs. And I'm concerned. I mean, look, for example, today you have to spend something like £1 billion or dollars in order to take your drug from the drawing board until marketing. How many companies can do that? I mean, take in England, for example, I can only think of two. I mean, there's AstraZeneca and GlaxoSmithKline. And I think we've got to find a way in which we can sort of do work with far lower costs, because, I think people have become obsessed with safety. And that's why we have to do these enormous numbers which you are talking about. No, I'm very concerned about that.
Now, a conventional thing to say at an end of a session like this is thank you, of course. And you will have discovered I know more about your life than you know, you lived it, but I know a great deal about it now. But also, I would obviously want to wish you many more healthy and wonderful years. But there's a better way of ending, because there's a wonderful reference at the end of the book to something that many people here have enjoyed, which is you sponsor a cantata series at the Royal Academy of Music. And of course, it's such a vast series that there are many, many, many more cantatas that still need to be performed. So, Ralph, can I say it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and may I wish you many more cantatas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure and a great honor. A great honor.